Welcome to Coffee with Joe for June 17th, 2010. It's a Thursday. Joe, there's talk
Salute.
of financial reform down in the halls of Congress these days. I don't think we're going to get a full reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, but St. Louis Fed Chief Bullard has
It's the
recently signed
latest.
on with
Right.
the Dallas Fed President Richard Fisher and Honig of the Kansas City
No,
Fed.
they're basically backing the Volcker Rule, Pete, okay, which is a reinstatement of some parts of Glass-Steagall. And it's kind of like there's nothing in there from absolutely preventing too big to fail. And too big to fail means they can actually take down the economy and the commercial banking system with it, okay? So there's nothing in there to prevent that. But what these provisions in the Volcker Rule are trying to impart is protection from the investment banking side's risks, Pete. Okay, that to say that right now a commercial and investment shadow banking arrangement can be broad, closely interconnected, so that if there's a failure on the investment banking side, the whole thing goes down. Now, it's not that your savings go down, it's that the economy goes down, Pete, okay? Because, your accounts are insured, and in theory, you're going to get your money back. But it's when the economy goes down, then it takes the banks down, the banks' loans got to be called, and all of that kind of stuff. So they're trying to get protections because why? Because those investment banks, what are they? They're basically casinos. They're basically risk taking, risk management, they call it, entities. Their job is managing risk, therefore taking risk. And and so what they're trying to do is to say that those risks don't deserve the protections that go with a commercial banking enterprise. The safety, whatever safety net it is, and even any access to anything from the Fed. So, for instance, when the crash came, Pete, okay, when the crash came, because they're not separated, that meant that anything that the government decided to do was going to be available to those investment banks, and that they got most of the bailout money, they got all that stuff. So, if these types of provisions are put in place, then that won't happen again. Then basically the investment banks will be on their own, which is minimally where they should be, taking the risk with their own money. Okay, it wouldn't prevent them from being too big to fail. Okay, that is to say, they can have trillions of dollars, of nominal investments, and therefore potential losses that really would seize up, if you will, the economy if they failed, Pete. Okay, because why? Because there has to be operating capital markets in order for there to be all kinds of business, and that's what would be at risk, But it's not the same thing as completely locking up the economy and threatening the well-being, especially of jobs and wages and all of those kind of things. That when the economy collapses because of a financial institution collapse, that's inevitable, that happens. So there are these protections. It's not the same as too big to fail. We don't really know what's going to be in the final bill, Pete, but one of the provisions, because remember the administration and Geithner and Bernanke, they all oppose these measures, Pete. Okay, they're well opposed to these measures.
On what grounds, Joe?
Pete, they don't really have to say on what grounds. What they say is, number one, you can't do that in this country, and not there'll be a flight of capital and risk, to some other country if you do that in this country. It has to be done internationally or cooperatively, internationally. But let me tell you why I think it is, Pete, why they really oppose it. Because the requirements from the separation is that not using the capital that's available to the commercial banks, okay, means that the investment banks are going to have to recapitalize this entity, okay? They're going to have to recapitalize this entity. And the fact of the matter is, it's going to be very difficult, Pete. Going to be very difficult for those investment banks to recapitalize these entities when the risks are all going to stay with the entity, when they lose the public backstop. So that's my opinion of why they won't. They're opposing it. Why? It's people like Geithner, people like Bernanke, people like Summers. They're like, whoa, this is going to really cause havoc for our investment bankers. You got Volcker, Volcker's the guy who's sitting in the back saying, wait a minute, this should be about protecting the currency, protecting the national economy, protecting the people from, undue, risks associated with financial capital marketeering, and so you see the difference there. The bankers still run the town, Pete. Okay, the bankers still run the town. It's the bankers in and out of Treasury, the bankers in and out of the Fed, and that's why it is truly a remarkable, series of events that these Fed presidents have come out and basically opposed the monetary policies of the federal government. Well, the job of the regional president of the Fed, Pete, is really to do what the whole Fed's supposed to do for the whole country, was promote economic stability and full employment, right? So that is to say, it's real economy stuff, Pete. And whenever there's a deregulation thing, it happens between New York and Washington, Pete. Happens between Wall Street and Washington. That's where the deregulation stuff happens. And those guys are sitting back there worrying about their communities, worrying about their banks, worrying about their industries, worrying about all that stuff. And they have to deal with it, But every once in a while, when you get a serious reform, like this thing coming down the pike, where they can see, their advantage of the soundness, the soundness and stability of their communities, it takes a lot for them to be able to get to a position where they can speak out on it, Pete. But it's truly a remarkable situation. It's truly something that is very commendable, Pete, to have these regional Fed presidents speaking out against what is basically their board, the whole board of governors. But to me, when you see something like this, you know that they're acting in the interest of their economy in a way that the whole Fed should be doing for everybody instead of the bankers. Measures. It's a real kick in the teeth to the American people, who elect somebody like Obama, who says, I'm going to change things, I'm going to fix things, and to have the same group of people in there wanting to do the same stuff, not fixing anything, just crapping around with what they're going to do about CEO pay or, some other ridiculous, totally meaningless, part of what's not even monetary policy. They don't even have a clue about monetary policy, these guys, Pete.
So, Joe, in about 60 seconds, what needs to happen?
Well, of course, besides these things, if you get right down to it, Pete, okay, the separation of all risks from the people ought to be put in place. And the only way you can do that is to separate the money creation, debt creation powers from the banks. The money creation, debt creation powers from the banks, and restore it back to the government. We put it back into the hands of the government. If the government's creating the money supply, then we're not relying on the banks to make loans in order to have money. That's the separation that really needs to happen. So that instead of going back to a part of Glass-Steagall, which is where we're headed, to all of Glass-Steagall, no, we need to go back to the Chicago Plan for Monetary Reform, Pete, and do the whole thing once and for all.
I'm so not surprised at that answer. Nor will most of our regular listeners be surprised at that answer.
Because it's the truth.
And we'll check in again next week.
All right, Pete.
Thanks,
buddy.